Good morning, and thank you, Vinod and others, for the opportunity to talk to you. Looking at the watch, I've run out of time. You want me to start all the same? I'll keep it short, and I'm particularly grateful for Nippon and Jimmy that they have covered already some ground of what I wanted to say, so that will give me the opportunity to maybe go a little faster on the environmental issues that I wanted to cover, and perhaps more focus on some of the policy issues and maybe context of policy issues that we may want to look at. So very briefly, my starting point usually is that we are looking at a sector that is particularly resource hungry in a number of ways. It occupies a large share of the terrestrial surface of the planet, something like 70% of total agricultural land if you include pasture land, and about 1/3 of the total cropland is dedicated to producing feed. That percentage goes up in industrialized countries to close to 60% in some places. So in OECD countries, typically more than half of all cropland is producing feed for livestock and not food directly. About 60% of the total anthropogenic biomass operation goes to livestock, and that is also pasture and crop residues and straight arable products. About 30% of agricultural water use is dedicated to livestock. That includes what they call not only blue water but also green and gray water. Gray water, the one that is being recycled and reused in some places. The long shadow put the greenhouse gas figure that livestock contributes to total greenhouse gas emissions at 18%. We're in the course of recalculating that, and the best estimate of today is something like 15%. We will produce an update on that later this year. As Jimmy has already pointed out, livestock is also a source of deforestation or cause of deforestation, particularly in Latin America, where pasture expansion and soybean arable land expansion is at the expense of forest and also associated degradation. Livestock is also a major source of water pollution, particularly in East Asia, where wet pig production systems are very predominant. So we're having if you want, two colliding trains here. We're having the global demand for livestock products that is projected to grow by 70 to 80% by the year 2050. A little less so in Asia, because part of that growth has already occurred in the last 20 years, particularly in China and other parts of East and Southeast Asia. In developed countries, we are seeing a stagnation in demand, very slow increase, and some people, including myself, even think it will go down quite quickly in some places. We have seen, for example, in the last 3 consecutive years of decline in consumption in the US and other places in Europe. So there may be a tipping point that we may have reached already in some places. Still, demand is very strong in what we call emerging countries, even though China seems to be running out of steam here a little bit, but you have another country, big country in Asia, India, that could possibly replace China as a locomotive for livestock sector growth, depending on how diets develop in India. In low-income countries, particularly in Africa and other parts of South Asia, the livestock revolution is only about to start, and that's where we have the highest growth rates. At the same time, we are having growing scarcities and risk when it comes to natural resources employed for the livestock sector. So oil, land, water, energy, phosphorus, they all seem to have peaked or are close to their peaks. And the real question is, can we continue to extract, to use these resources as we have done so over the last 200 years, ever since industrialization started? Environmental degradation and pollution are also compromising the quality of natural resources, and climate change injects an amount of uncertainty that makes projections very difficult for the years to come. Just to say that I'm not discussing something that is an esoteric concern of some environmentalists. These are the feed prices over the last 10 years. I don't know whether you followed the news. Maize just has peaked last month with the highest ever recorded prices due to droughts in the US, but also Russia and India not having good harvests. And for soybeans, we are also on track of seeing a new peak. You see that there has been a flat trend until about 2007, 2008 with the first food crisis. And even though the world economy has not fully recovered and sometimes not recovered at all, we are having the highest ever recorded prices for these two important feed components. Not only that, we are also on course for having 2012 as the highest, as the warmest year on record in the world. So there are real concerns when it comes to availability of natural resources, and I think these are reflected in this graph here. Now, just coming to why livestock may be different from other commodities and why the natural resource constraint may be so important for livestock. And we've already seen from the previous presentations that the production of animal protein, particularly when used on concentrate feed, is typically less efficient than that of plant protein. You're bound to lose in energy and nutrient conversion if you use another organism to convert something that you could already use directly as food. Talk of cereals, for example. The second issue is that very often you have livestock in remote areas. And these remote areas, margin areas, mountain areas, dry areas, difficult in some way, are often out of reach for the local authorities, for public authorities. That causes neglect, but is also the very reason why we have expansion into forest of livestock and why we have overgrazing. So it's the remoteness, the marginal nature of many of these areas that is also a cause for natural resource degradation. And on the other side, we're having intensive systems that, because they are pulled into urban demand and because scaling up, as we've heard, and integration of food chains is occurring, they're very often detached from the land base. Countries import feed rather than livestock products, as we've heard. We've heard that the share of trade in production of livestock products is only about 10%, but that of feed is 25%, and that of soybeans is 60%. So it indicates that feed is transported to production systems which are then deconnected or disconnected from the feed base, that results into nutrient depletion where feed is produced and overloads where livestock are produced. So very quickly, as Jimmy has already indicated, we believe that there is a great gain in trying to push up efficiency, and particularly the efficiency of natural resource use, the efficiency by which land, water, nutrients are converted into animal products, and that there are huge gaps between attainable and actually attained efficiency. And these gaps can be closed with existing technology, and given that there are so many of sort of suboptimal producers, there's a lot to be gained by making technology available to large numbers of producers. And just to illustrate the point, here we have nitrogen use efficiency in dairy production, and every country here representing a dot. And if you just look at, do I have a pointer here? At East and Southeast Asia, which goes from about 3% to sort of 35%, and that is the percentage of nitrogen that you find in the product as opposed to what you provide as feed. So it shows the huge range by which nitrogen efficiency, use efficiency, is being calculated, is being expressed, and it gives an indication of the potential for improvement. By the same token, this is a graph that we very often use. Here it shows the emission intensity, that is the CO2 equivalent emitted by dairy production per liter of milk, and how that changes when productivity goes up. So there is an inverse relationship. The higher the productivity, the lower the emission intensity, and there's a very strong relationship, and it points to the important efficiency and emission intensity gains that can be made by simply investing in higher productivity. Coming to grasslands, and here again I can pick up on what Jimmy has said. These areas have the highest incidence of poverty. There are people here who basically have no other option of making a livelihood. There are poor people living here, widespread degradation, but also when it comes to environmental services, they're hardly recognized and they're not exploited. And we believe that improved range management can help to restore these areas, to store carbon and provide other environmental services, including water and biodiversity. But for that, we need carbon finance and other forms of payment for environmental services to change the production function of these grasslands by focusing more on environmental services. An idea of where the degraded grasslands are, they're pretty much everywhere. They're not limited to developing countries. But then if we look at the potential to sequester carbon in grasslands, the inland areas of Asia, in northern China, in Mongolia, Inner Mongolia, but also parts of Pakistan and India, these are the areas where a lot can be gained in terms of carbon sequestration if only we can establish the necessary methodologies and certification protocols for this to happen. The animal manure and the intensification side, as I already pointed out, is often caused by the geographic concentration of livestock in certain areas in Asia, particularly around urban centers. And just to give you an idea of the dimension of the problem, the total amounts of nutrients in livestock excreta exceeds that applied in synthetic fertilizer. We are talking about a huge resource that is very poorly utilized. About 50 to 90% of the nutrients contained in feed are excreted as in the form of manure. And about 30% of the energy is contained in manure as opposed to what is in feed. But the technology to recover most of the energy and to recycle most of the nutrients, with the exception of nitrogen, is available. But for that, we need policies that address the spatial distribution of livestock in order to create opportunities for this recycling and recovering to occur. Again, to show, Jimmy has already mentioned the high percentage of pigs in Asia. This just shows how much that is concentrated. And if you drill down further, you will see that even at provincial, even at county level, there is a strong tendency to cluster around slaughterhouses, around ports, around preferred outlets, or even in areas like is the case for the US, for example, where environmental regulations are more lenient than in other places. So a strong clustering tendency that prevents the recycling of waste. I'm just quickly going into some of the policy issues that are related to livestock environment or livestock and natural resources. Of course, very generally speaking, they relate to market failures, they relate to externalities, and they relate to the need for equitable growth, particularly because of the huge numbers of people who are involved in the livestock sector. So for the three focus areas that I've mentioned, there need to be a focus on efficiency of natural resource use. It's a little different from productivity, but efficiency here really focusing on how we transform natural resources into livestock products. The need to recover and recycle energy and nutrients from livestock waste, and to restore grasslands for livelihoods and environmental services. All that is being shaped in the agenda, the global agenda of action for sustainable livestock development, which we are developing together with multiple partners as a multi-stakeholder initiative, which I can provide further information on if you're interested. But I just want to go back to a discussion that Jimmy and others, OIE also was involved, we had in Nairobi earlier this year. We're talking about the diversity of context, and that there is not really a bill that fits everything when it comes to the different conditions of livestock. So at the time we said, well, maybe we should distinguish between different growth situations. We have livestock very important in areas where there is no growth, where these are areas of endemic poverty. Livestock are basically the main provider of livelihoods and providing a safety net to people who have very little option for doing anything different. There are other areas, and I think Nippon has pointed out some of this, in India, in Philippines, in Brazil, in Thailand, where there is a strong demand for livestock products, and where livestock come in as a provider of income and employment, where they can be hooked into the growth process, and very often they can also be a locomotive for rural-based growth in the absence of alternatives in rural areas. And then there are areas where we are post-growth, and sometimes we are suffering the consequences of growth in terms of pollution, in terms of food safety issues. So here, the policy focus shifts away from the producer more to the needs of urban consumers. So the need for safe, clean, and healthy food. And I think these three contexts could be useful also in framing our policies, or the way we look at policies, as this is a regional policy forum focusing on Asian livestock. So in the no-growth areas, in the endemic poverty areas, I think we are talking mainly about social policies. We're talking about social protection programs, handouts, subsidies, but also sort of flanked by education and healthcare efforts. And very often, we simply have to acknowledge that the carrying capacity in terms of people is exceeded, and that in the absence of other industries or economic activities, we need to facilitate out-migration. The point here is that in these areas, the prospect for productivity improvement, for hooking into markets is limited, and we may want to focus on social policies as a way to address the human suffering and the human needs in these areas. At the same time, from a livestock point of view, we need to stabilize the resource base, partial areas and partial degradation in particular, and you may want to prevent the killer livestock diseases simply because if animals die, people will also be affected, severely affected, because livestock is what they depend on. Now, in the growth context, here, livestock as a provider of income and employment, it's not the social policy that we focus on, but typically we focus on economic policies, on stimulus policies, on getting the growth stimulus into the right context, the right areas, the right commodities, the infrastructure and market development that needs to happen in order to support the growth stimulus in these areas. And for that, we need technology development and transfer. So main point here, when there is growth, when there is demand, you may want to use economic policies as the major tool to improve performance, societal performance of the sector. But from a health point of view here, it's not the killer diseases, but you may want to focus on the productivity limiting and maybe also on the trade restricting diseases. And from an environmental point of view, resource use efficiency, as I have explained before, comes into focus. Now, the post-growth or problems of growth areas, as I said, safe, clean, and healthy food. The urban consumer comes into focus. And here we're talking mainly about regulatory policies. In the first place, they address food quality and safety, environmental regulations, and at a certain point, occupational health and animal welfare, as has already been pointed out, also come into focus, but they're mainly regulatory policies where, you know, the public policies really look after providing a safe and clean and healthy context for food production to happen. Focuses on public health and sustainable and healthy diets, and to reduce waste and the environmental footprint of livestock products, more generally speaking. So the basic point I would like to make is that livestock policies don't really exist per se. In many European countries, we don't have a Ministry of Agriculture anymore. So what we need to look at when we talk about livestock policies is that how can we integrate them, incorporate them into other policies, health policies, economic policies, educational policies, trade policies, and so on. So it is really our task as livestock practitioners and livestock policymakers to make sure that the specific livestock aspects get recognition in all these other sets of policies, rather than to look for a standalone livestock sector policy. I don't think we will get very far with that. And the point here is really that, you know, livestock, as we have seen also with Jimmy's presentation, is a key component of the big global questions that we are trying to answer. Poverty, food security, the threat of pandemics, climate change, resource scarcity, economic growth and stability. You know, at the core of that, to some extent, you all have livestock issues. But at the same time, the livestock sector, the livestock development, as Nippon pointed out, is driven by all kinds of other big drivers over which we have no control. Population growth, industrialization, globalization, growing wealth and persisting poverty, spread of knowledge and technology. So there are these big drivers that we just have to accept. They're just there. There's nothing we can do about that. And since we have these big questions and these big drivers, the conclusion is that the operating space for livestock, well, the livestock sector is very small, which means we have to adjust. We can't really shape. You know, we just are not powerful enough. We must fit into a context that is kind of given to us. And that means we have to look for integrated policies, not really look for standalone livestock sector policies. We need to be very smart about where we put our efforts, look for opportunities, and do targeting to the best extent we can, and to pool our talents and resources through multi-stakeholder processes. Thank you.